Možemo krenuti.
Super. Super. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Damir Arsenijević, for those who don't know me. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome a dear friend of mine and colleague, Professor Jasmina Husanovic, who is going to be talking to us today about justice from below in arts, academia, and activism, and talking about resistance as a critical history of the present. The idea is that Jasmina is just going to give some brief introduction, and then the two of us are going to engage in a dialogue, following which we are just going to open the floor to questions. So I'm going to briefly introduce Jasmina. Jasmina is a full professor of cultural and gender studies at Tuzla University in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We work together in the English department, but we also work together as part of the Workers' University in Tuzla, which was created on the barricade of the workers' struggles in the early teens, 2000 teens, as they call them. So today, both of us will be reflecting on the method of work of communities academia, talking about the Workers' University, the archive of consolidated and joint work, and the platform Zemlja-Voda-Zrak, and the new initiatives of Ekofem in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So without further ado, Jasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Damir, for inviting me. Thank you, Rijeka. This sounds a little bit like Eurovision. Thank you, Rijeka. But anyway, you know what I mean. I'm really pleased that we are together here, and then Damir and I are able to discuss a few things together with you that have been informing and inspiring our work in the last couple of decades. And as you probably saw from the abstract of my talk today, I will try to basically elaborate a little bit on some ideas that have informed those trajectories of resistance that we've been involved to, resistance to the dominant regimes of power in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how we have thought of and enacted such pathways of hopeful politics, and what we actually theorized also as radical imaginaries or practices of transformative justice in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So basically, I'm going to talk about some ideas, values, and lessons that have informed several of interventions that have emerged in the intersecting circles of art, academia, and activism, based in Tuzla, but quite internationalist in its outlook and also in its membership and ideas. And mostly to focus, actually, I'm aiming to focus mostly on the methods, on some of the methods of collaborative work, which has been based on critical pedagogies and on the concept of community as academia, which I've developed together with Damir, and that has been also embodied in the work of platforms such as Workers' University or Aura, or Zemlja-Voda-Zrak, or Ekofem Bosnia and Herzegovina today, etc., etc. So I'm actually really looking forward to this critical dialogue with you and Damir around some of the key challenges concerning our collaboration, concerning the production of the very material conditions for socially engaged, politically engaged knowledge and social practice, social activism, including the sphere, including large sphere of social justice, but very particular issues within it, and lately focusing mostly on the ecological aspect of things. So it is about this, about the challenges of this production of the material conditions for transformative politics of vision, spaces, and agents, and without too much of the introduction. I just want to see how we have, for instance, looked at this particular intersection between cultural studies, political philosophy, and critical pedagogy when we thought of the politics of care and politics of social justice from interdisciplinary angle, and have started from this critique of the politics of identity, which we find dominant around us. So basically, our claim has been that we can actually resist identitarian violence only by taking a very particular emancipatory take on these complex knots between difference and diversity, justice and equality. And this is why from early days, 2 decades ago, the focus has been on this. On the promising practices in the field of cultural production, knowledge production, and social activism. These 3 things, or art, academia, activism, which have been, but on those practices that have somehow struggled against the dominant technologies of governing trauma, governing its insecurity, governing poverty, etc. So the questions of exploitation, extraction, and alienation have been central to these resistances to concurrent political regimes of power, including neoliberal and ethno-capitalist face of it or side of it, because we thought that this is inseparable from the problem of commodification that we have both in our knowledge and in our citizenship, or practices of knowledge and practices of citizenship. I would also say that this work has been further complicated by the deep shift that has happened in the cultural politics of emotions in everyday life, due to the dramatic loss of public and social goods, as well as those forms of knowledge and forms of life associated with the very existence of those lost, plundered, destroyed, or stolen goods. So forms of life, knowledge, and political subjectivity, which are basically endangered by new hierarchies and vulnerabilities around us. So I think the key idea was how, in this context, we can encircle productive terrain for critical or interdisciplinary or intersectional and intersectoral approaches to economic, political, and social violence and exploitation, including our own positioning in public life and activism, including our own workplaces, in education, and in everyday life. So I would say that such thoughts and practices have been informed by post-colonial, materialist, Marxist, feminist insights, and in a way that helped us to reorient or shift the study of practice of emancipatory politics towards the questions of, let's say, transformative social care, maybe not knowledge production, or in community education, all in order to resist these dominant neoliberal deadlocks and catastrophes of sociality and politicality around us. So I remember when we were writing some 15 years ago that article, Damir and me, called "Community as Academia." We have been quite inspired by the work of Griselda Pollock, and she has one article, "The Daydream of the Political," where she says something like, well, speaking about cultural studies in particular, but we thought that this basically in general refers to our knowledge production and the kind of knowledge production that we wanted to embody. So this is the quote. So cultural studies have always been more than a discipline. It is a political project that puts right on board the precarious dynamics between knowledge and action, or the action of knowing and the action led by knowledge, which takes place in the classroom. the question for cultural studies, whose critical pedagogies have transformed the politics of education in numerous ways over the last decades, focuses on the practices of cultural criticism and analysis that in gender classrooms and then I'm going to switch to another quote here by Rancière to this concept of classroom as an emancipated community, which is in fact a community of storytellers and translators. So I think that from the very first moment we thought about communal space of knowledge production and transformative politics, communal space, where we are both actors and spectators, transforming the relationships of inequality into community of equals. So it was our major concern since the start, and we have had a long-running program of public and open classrooms that are quite connected to critical practice, and they're also very connected to what has happened in 2014 with plenums and protests. They have been connected also with student plenums in Tuzla in 2009. So basically, I think that this concept of educational classroom as a critical practice, transgressing traditional models of knowledge transmission, has been there from the start, and how we can do this through non-authoritarian process or practice based on cooperative learning, based on experiences and passions around texts and stories of culture, everyday social life in general. So the practices of cultural criticism, the methods of cultural analysis cannot be confined to higher, in the walls of higher education and traditional classroom culture. That is our stance, which is why our classrooms happen elsewhere, not within. Our key classrooms happen outside of the walls of higher education and traditional classroom culture, and also against the logic that is constantly produced and reproduced at our institutions, including humanities. So we actually sought the space where we can have critical intellectual life together. One of the key documents of Workers' Universities, Workers' University in Tuzla, is called "How Do We Work Together?", where we politically claim the means of knowledge production, including the resistance to commodification, exploitation, and alienation, as I said in the beginning, and basically against this university classroom as the privileged site of learning and ideological inoculation, we have somehow posited something else, and that is a complex world of experiences, interests, and passions shared by our students, by our fellow citizens, by workers, and ourselves, that actually want to resist various forms of injustice and quite traumatic hurts and vulnerabilities that somehow mark their lives. So perhaps a few more notes on this idea of education together with socially relevant and politically relevant practice, education as the common good, which has been cynically given up in most of our institutions. And so I'd like us perhaps today to talk about this political commitment to knowledge production as an intervention that actively participates in social transformation, not just comments on it, because this is, I think we will all agree that this is how ideology operates at its best, through through this cynical disavowal of political commitment. So basically, somehow pushing aside this notion that somehow we should forget that we are all subjective factors in history, and as political subjects we make our own history. This is why in the title of the lecture today you have this resistances as a critical history of the present, and by that I'm explicitly referring to Foucauldian and Kantian notion that somehow what we do today is revaluing the values that have been historically formed for us and given to us on a plate, and specifically they've been drastically ideologically formed in the 1990s through the grind of neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism today. So there is a foreclosure of political subjectivity in academia, and but it is essentially futile activity because life happens, and we see university blockades of student protests, or we see citizens uprising, we see protests in plenums internationally and locally. It's interesting how also to reflect why this has been happening less so in the last 5-6 years, since 2015. So it's not just because of COVID pandemics, etc., but all these genuine expressions of frustration against the few who seem determined to make the future a miserable, small-minded and dead-filled place for the many are still happening, but perhaps are not as collectivized as was the case in the period between 2008 and 2015, not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina or the region, the Yugoslav region, but also globally. So, let me go back to this question of the space for the creation of joint struggle between the workers and students, considering the formation of this new precariat as noticed by the changing natures of how we articulate our subjectivities or our struggles, etc. So, so I will just perhaps briefly mention how the Workers' University in Tuzla that originated just after, during and after the protest and plenums in Bosnia and Herzegovina brought together this kind of community as academia, and how after that we have been urged by political shifts conjoined with ecological catastrophes because of these dystopic scenarios that have befallen both politically and ecologically Tuzla area, but also the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So when we talk about justice and social justice, our trajectories have proven that somehow our limited experiences of political violence span from genocide to ecological devastation, and they are interlinked. And so the earlier work on the politics of memory and genocide that have investigated limit points in the range of discourses such as law, forensics, bureaucracy, etc., was also about this search for a community of equals that intervenes into difficult subjects through new forms of classrooms, new activist practices, produced by, through the collectively, also produced through the common work of artists, theorists, students, where we basically take on emancipatory take on community education as something that is connected to real existing resistances to political, social, economic injustice. So I think I will say just a few more words and ask these, posit these questions so Damir and I can continue in our discussion, elucidating this, and that is how we should think of community as academia today, in this very moment, considering what we experience today when it comes to exclusion, exploitation, and domination, with all sorts of problems that we have around us, starting from ecological injustice and poverty, etc., going to race, to ethnocentrism, elitism, colonialism, patriarchy, homophobia, all sorts of symptoms of neoliberalism that also somehow shatters our work together. I'm particularly interested in us discussing what has happened inside the movements, how the logic of privatization, horizontal hostility, alienation from the inside, mistrust, how that has crumbled us from within, and how the key challenge was to actually sustain energies for progressive politics today. And I think it has been something that I think is common to all protests, all these resistances around us globally. So especially in the context of the crisis caused by the pandemics. Now we have the war in Ukraine, but we still have to sustain the energies in the ways in which we, both on micro and macro level, individually and collectively, somehow resist the deepening exploitation, alienation, and extraction of life energies and life worlds around us. So I'll stop here and let us now discuss perhaps what does it mean to live spaces of solidarity today in cooperative knowledge and creative collective public action. Where are these critical energies where we actually should invest the most in order to resist the ideological lies constitutive of the regimes around us, because I think this is the key question for many of us today. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmina. Mm-hmm. Jasmina, how would you like to proceed? Do you want us to possibly kind of, exchange a few words to kind of as like an interval between opening the floor to other participants, as a kind of like intermediary gesture into this? Possibly I could reflect.
Yeah, maybe I can ask you a question first, or maybe we should start from there. I spoke, so maybe that we have when we thought about all these issues, we have been also inspired by Raymond Williams's quote on how to the production and the practice of possibility. So how to produce practical hope. So what does it mean for us today to produce practical hope, focusing on social care or the reinvention of the politics of care in the face of, let's say, ecological crisis, or the plunging of public goods that are in the sphere of water or air or energy in general, and so on.
Well, I mean, this is possibly key, because I think the concerns that we've had so far have been, which is the continuation of that quote by Raymond Williams. It is what Raymond Williams talks about, the materiality of the idea. And I think what we are sort of witnessing recently is that there is this paucity of imagining new collective ideas, and I think there is a lot invested into the breakup of any sort of collectivization of ideas, and I think through practice, through concrete work, we've been trying to lift off the ground the new ideas, and the only novelty which we witnessed being produced was at the barricade of the workers themselves, and this was the key and crucial moment for the establishment of the Workers' University, was that they themselves made a split in the institutionalized forms of struggle through the strike, and invented a new model of fighting. So they said, mi nismo u štrajku, mi smo u protestu za proizvodnju. So we are not on strike, we are in protest to maintain the production. And I think, for many reasons, particularly in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, what does it mean to be in protest to maintain the production when everything is geared towards halting the production of the possibility? Because from 0 point start, they were fighting to maintain the production of the factory that was going to be stripped of assets and completely cause devastation and the ruination of their lives and the community in which they live. So I think to be in protest to maintain the production has been productive and fruitful for our thinking, as both the novel idea and as that which actually defended at least something against the onslaught of privatization. I'm not going to enter into what happened later with the Dita factory, the detergent factory that was defended. But I think the novelty of the idea produced the effects, and I think that it continues to produce the effects for us. I mean, I think other than this, there hasn't been any sort of new idea on the horizon to help us actually fight the onslaught of colonial projects that are in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that are geared towards producing people as waste, as we have been talking about. I mean, it's a political concern, not just the environmental concern as such, etc., etc. So I think there is a lot of invested through international waste colonialism, but particularly Serbian and Croatian colonial projects on Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnia acting as a symptom of the impossibility still of the breakup of Yugoslavia. So I think that takes me to think about how to shift towards some sort of courageous acts in this seemingly hopeless situation, and how to actually flip us from this position of the waste. What does it mean? Human waste, ecological waste, all sorts of waste of ideas and people's bodies and environments, to kind of think about the radical redrawing and reclaiming and taking over the space, actually taking over both space, time, and we are finally, I mean, something that keeps never being mentioned in these ideas of revolting against the authoritarian onslaughts is a property. I mean, the final kind of victory of the idea of the private property against any sort of commoning practices.
Yes, and I think that was basically part of this whole drive, is to expanding this notion of atrocity politics and what atrocity actually, how we should redefine it, because in the work on trauma and mass graves, I use this also trope of mass grave to say it's a metaphor. Mass grave is a metaphor for human waste, basically, and so that's through the notion of waste, we can see the connection between various forms of struggle, because I think this kind of public bads and public harms, they have been redefined as the time progresses in the last 2 decades, not because something becomes non-important, etc., but also because we are following the energies and the passions and the imaginaries on the field, so to say, looking where politics, promising progressive politics happens amongst people, because where their motivations lie, etc. So you can't. So that's how from, I'm going to say 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, where most of this work in our public classrooms have been around genocide and these issues, because it was really difficult to teach them in the classroom and almost impossible. And we did some things that were previously thought like really hard to do, where we had students from Banja Luka and students from Tuzla discussing these issues really productively together, but also in a different kind of classroom, not the traditional classroom and not the classic university classrooms outside of them. But this notion of energies against waste, against everything kind of dissipating and being wasteful around us is, I think, important also to consider in the following way. Let's say our students today, they have, I'm like thinking it's very hard to even explain to them the kinds of structures of feeling that we could see in collective forms of action in this period between 2008 and 2014, because something really, I think, changed drastically in terms of this conservative, neoconservative backlash. And as you say, there is, something, what kind of waste is happening inside these progressive circles. So we can perhaps posit the cancel culture as a typical kind of overall problem that has really damaged the left, damaged feminist circles, etc. So either the the logic of privatization through gossip and slander and internal sectarianism, but also overall in the culture today, you have the cancel culture. So I think that for young people today, for students, it's really even a bigger challenge, because in the culture, overall culture, their everyday life that they're exposed to in the last 6-7 years, they can't see these, they haven't experienced many of these collectivizing moments of solidarity. So I find that as a sort of like double challenge today. I don't know. I just think that it was that something structurally has changed for most of us in the last 6-7 years, and it's not only pandemics. So we actually have to think how this whole political economy of emotions has changed and how it is affecting our collective work.
I think this is all the more important, thinking about the ever stronger depletion, particularly talking about the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in which hopelessness is continually produced. So there is, to take this whole notion of waste further, there is almost like, for lack of a better word, super egoical vantage point that demands us to identify with waste. So, and that has been monetized. I think the push for people to, and younger people in particular, to identify as waste, as worth for nothing, as the country being their worth for nothing, is having very particular effects of ever greater exodus, impossibility, devaluing anything that's possible to do. So very often you will hear people say, nothing can be done. This, we must, we must leave the country. This is all shit, etc., etc. So I think there is something operative in the current political economic setup, this monetization of identification with the waste, and how this is then productive of not just particular affects, but and gestures, but the depletions that are happening around any sort of possibility to collectivize thinking and action.
Remember, both, let's say, on this locale in Bosnia and Herzegovina, once you start asking economic questions, as it happened in 2014, and questions of redistribution, you had this huge, again, counteroffensive, counter-revolution, so to say, to actually, again, turn everything into identitarian questions or culturalize it, turn it into culture wars, etc. So globally, we see culture wars. And I was quite surprised, for instance, that a lot of now people 18, 19, 20 years old, when you say culture wars, and they say, what culture wars? And then they say, well, what we are living today are culture wars, etc. And then you explain to them, and they're like, yeah. So basically, they have already naturalized it in a way. They grew up into it. So I'm talking really about these generations that are coming of age now, and that are now in our classrooms, and etc. How new forms of culture wars and identity repressions have been pushed into them, and it looks as this is how politics is done. But actually, when you go back just not even a decade ago, you see, and you have to reteach these repoliticizations to your own students. Like, look, there were plenums happening in Zagreb, there were, in Tuzla, etc. This is what happened in 2014, etc. So I would just like to emphasize how strong this push backwards is on through these ways in which we are even our cultural politics of emotions work, and we can actually somehow, I think, reflect on it, but it's really difficult, I think, for a lot of people to historicize the moment they're in. And I think this is our role as well, to help to somehow ask and show things, ask right questions, and show perhaps right lessons or things, so people can so we can together historicize the moment that we are in, intergenerationally. And I think we haven't mentioned this, but a lot of our classrooms and platforms have this intergenerational aspect to it, very strong one, precisely because in intergenerational dialogues you can historicize things happening to you differently, because you have different kind of perspectives on how the materiality of idea happens or gets destroyed or doesn't happen, etc. Yeah.
I think this would be a good time to kind of invite others. Anyone, just, it doesn't need to be a question, reflection, association, whatever occurs to you. And I would add here, with as little censorship of yourself as possible.
Damir, no, go on, because it's such a good dialogue between two of you. So I think that you need to push even further in questioning all at stake, because you do it so well. Jasmina, you.
Okay, others? Well, let's have another turn. Katarina.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Katarina Kucic. I'm a former CAS fellow. So it's nice to be back. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And yeah, there's so much that I want to know more about. So I'm looking forward to the continuation. But also I'm wondering this comment on how politics are basically depoliticized to culture wars and identity politics. I wonder if we are maybe too judgmental or too quick to judge the new forms of politics that maybe our students are practicing. And I ask this just because I have been reading recently around mobilizations around environmental issues all over former Yugoslavia or the Balkans. And I think we do see, I don't know, this is, from my kind of maybe perhaps a bit removed, this is a new type of mobilization and it is a new type of politics. So I wonder if there is maybe something, if there is something more hopeful rather than just the reduction of mobilization to culture wars or to identity politics. And I just wanted to ask you, because I know that you have this platform also for environmental humanities. So I also wanted to ask, yeah, if you can expand on this, like in relation to kind of mobilizations, but also in general and with your work on these things. But thank you so much. It's a really pleasure to listen.
Thank you, Katerina. Can I just ask you?
Interesting.
Jasmina, can I just ask Katerina? I would like to ask Katerina, which actually mobilizations around mental health issues do you particularly have in mind?
No, I had the environmental issues. That's what I was saying.
Right.
Yeah. So whether that
I heard you say mental health issues.
Oh, sorry. No, I meant environmental.
Which is really interesting kind of slip that I heard. So
I heard mental issues as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it would be. I think it is also something that we could reflect on, right?
No,
because
absolutely.
I think
absolutely.
there's
absolutely.
or like the lack of mobilization on mental issues.
I wasn't actually talking about the lack of mobilization today. I was actually. It's interesting that you perhaps heard in all of this some sort of judgment, like that young people are not active. I was not saying that. I just mentioned one thing, that a lot of my students have been surprised by this term, culture wars. What culture wars, etc. So I'm just saying, like, we actually have these culture wars globally described as culture wars. Particularly since Trump, Brexit, Me Too, etc., since 2015-16, etc., described also this way. So that's why I'm just kind of saying for some of my students who are not that politically active, so I'm not talking about mobilized students at all. Even the term culture wars was new. But in terms of like what mobilizations we have and the sort of kind of judgment that is precisely opposite from what we are doing on mobilizations in the sphere of environmental activism are precisely what we are actually actively doing in the last couple of years, including like based on our discussions, for instance, but based on the discussions and work together lately in the last couple of years, we have in Bosnia now, for instance, the formation of this platform Ekofem BiH, so ecofeminist. So it's precisely around the new environmentalist mobilizations in the region, where my interest is basically to see as much leftist, as much Marxist, as much post-colonial feminist and materialist feminist drive here as possible, not to let these mobilizations also happen just on the liberal side of things. If you know what I mean, it's just not enough. Sometimes the momentum is there, but the question is, how do left and feminist circles intervene, and how do they position themselves in these new grassroots mobilizations? I don't think it is happening enough, if I may say so. In that sense, I am judgmental simply because I'm self-critical as well. And so I don't think that in these new green transitions, feminist circles for instance, that do have such lessons of social justice struggles and peace movement, etc., in the last 3 decades, I don't think that they're doing enough. What we've seen, for instance, on the feminist side of things in Serbia and Croatia, also culture wars lately. Last year, the whole thing around Center for Women's Studies, the transgender, etc. So there was something else happening there, but a lot of that was basically exactly like who is radical feminist on this scene, etc. You saw there a lot of energies being drawn away to these questions, which I would say are also not properly political, because they do not look, what are we obfuscating at the moment, where we are actually not. I'm not saying these issues are not important, but the question is, why are all our energies going into these issues and questions that are, to me, politically not a priority, and we are not, organizing in some other, let's say, in these environmental struggles regionally that are happening, for instance. So those are the questions that I'm asking myself when thinking about social activism in the region. And and this threat that also these energies, regional energies, will just be kind of dissipated through liberalizing, neoliberalizing, professionalizing kind of things. We already see it on this scene, how questions get incorporated and co-opted and lose the edge, the proper political edge. That's I don't know whether I kind of a little bit answered this.
I mean, my take on what you, Katerina, posed as a question, and what Jasmina has just said, is that I can perceive something as what I would term as ghettoization of the idea and dispersion of the population. I think what the ideology of civil society that replaced any sort of collectivization, not just kind of ushered in specific modes of identity politics, but I think its articulation fetishized these identities and monetized them to such an extent so as to prevent any sort of solidarity being created. So there is culturalization of identity rather than politicization, and we have witnessed that through various types of trickle-down economies through the NGOs and stuff, when actually people were forced to fight for some sort of capital in order to survive. So I think let me term it in different ways. You could perceive it as particular types of enclosures that are happening, or privatizations of identity that the ideology of civil society is doing. So the logic is one of curating the self in such a way so as you are the commodity for the other. Let me to put it in this sense, rather than coming together in some sort of collectivity that could be more than the sum parts of some of the individual parts. So I think that's something, and particularly I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina, with Jasmina, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean there are around 20,000 NGOs, right? I mean it's a horrific number, right? And how this is,
I don't think it's 20,000, but I think
20, I said I wasn't giving more, but I'm just thinking about how this whole push of the civil society kind of naturalized the looting of what we cannot actually we are not allowed to go back to the notion of socially owned property, which is the key. Once we have accepted the full logic of private property, we by definition, accepted the new division of labor. And, you know, unless we question that, we cannot tinker with you know, and think about that we can actually change the current division of labor, because everything else is cosmetic and the kind of pose. Because unless what is the idea of communism? The idea of communism is the abolishment of private property. Everything else, you know, as long as there is this kind of private property in operation, there is going to be such structural inequalities as we are witnessing today in this turbo model of greater, even greater accumulation of capital that's now happening with you know 0.01% of the rich, you know, and this is why we see greater turn of the screw in authoritarian modalities. This is why we see like, you know, some of my colleagues, psychoanalysts in Brazil, are working on the questions of these Uber drivers who are at the same time having to kind of do everything. It's entrepreneurial logic is taken to such an extreme logic, such an extreme point that, you know, everything is there. They have to do everything themselves, and they are alone. The obverse side of this is, for instance, you hear a Brazilian Uber driver who says, you know, I need to become an octopus, right? Otherwise, they say, otherwise I'll be killed by the future, right? So this is an impossible split. So you are completely and utterly alone, and then you have to morph. There is an imperative for you to evolve beyond human possibilities in order to survive, because the future is persecutorial to such an extent that the future kills, right? So what kind of life can we imagine otherwise than this, right? And this is, I'm giving a notion of a Brazilian worker. This could be a Bosnian worker in the factory. I mean, it could be, you know, there is metaphoricity happening here, but I think two poles are not so wide apart. I mean, one is the obverse side of the other. So there is this kind of such alienation that we are forced to kind of do everything. There's this kind, you know, Wendy Brown will talk about it as sacrificial citizenship, you know, but there is the valence of this is such that you have to, like, everything is kind of delegated to you, farmed out to you, and you have to do it.
Yes,
and
if I may say so basically the extent of vulnerability, of our vulnerabilities, is so hyphenated, amplified at the moment, precisely amongst those who you would like, you know, and who you would like, or who are somehow wishing to get mobilized. But what is, on the other hand, what kind of community as activists do we have at the moment? Actually, it's increasing our vulnerability. So why would you feel often it is increasing our vulnerabilities? Because by definition, when you're working with others, especially, you are opening yourself up. And I would say that on this level, people see opening themselves up as increasing this vulnerability, and not actually seeing that somehow inside these collective efforts, they will get also some sort of like care or solidarity, etc. Because often we see actually, even inside the scenes, betrayals happening, or people say, oh, it's awful, or blah, 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 or we, even ourselves, were, you know, sometimes discourage people from and getting involved, because we talk about our multiple betrayals on the inside scene, etc. So, but we still kind of persist, etc. But I'm saying, like, what is, you know, when you have such levels of exposures and vulnerabilities inside the movements, when collectivizing, you have to be aware of how in the internal logic, yes, we will become even more vulnerable at some point. But on the other hand, what is there in the sense of this hopeful politics? What is the practical hope? What is how people feel stronger or better, or in any sense more hopeful through collective work together? What kind of collective work is really making them more hopeful or stronger in the face of such vulnerabilities, and not more vulnerable? Especially if we have this kind of auto-cannibalistic atmosphere on the left. It is, I would say, often going into in those obscene directions. So I think these are the questions that we don't have to answer today. We just have to be, I would say, constantly aware of it, that there is something deeply alienating inside the progressive scenes that we haven't reflected enough. And we haven't reflected enough our own forms of alienation inside the progressive movements. That's the big.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to continue this, Katarina, by focusing on the slip. When I heard from environmental to mental health, I mean, I think I'm thinking about what
collective hallucination.
I mean, yes. I mean, not only just what it is that we are hallucinating, but I'm actually thinking about, Jasmina mentioned the vulnerabilities, and I started talking about how psychic pain has been monetized and continues to be monetized, and we have various various practices of people sedating themselves, etc., and then becoming kind of patched up subjects of to be useful. But I increasingly don't think that's the case anymore. I think increasingly, what my experience and analysis has been is that the capital has found a way to monetize this time of dying, time of people getting anxious and getting depressed, right? Time of not just being reduced to waste, but the transition, like getting completely desperate and trying to overcome this desperation, trying to compensate for it. What we are calling, okay, in other words, capital has found a way to monetize survival. But survival implies dying and coming out of the dying. So I think, not only have we seen this through the logic of victimhood that's produced in Bosnia and kind of very exploited. So, it's become a governance model, right? But I think increasingly, we are seeing it through environmental, right, things like having these huge looming catastrophes, on the impossibility of even detecting where the sites of buried industrial wastes are. But I think our vulnerabilities are amplified precisely because on what could be the emancipatory gestures. I'll give you one example. Nobody on the left in Croatia, nobody, and I've had this talk about it for years on environmental issues. We can talk about queer politics until cows come home, right? We can talk about various performative gestures, but not a single person on the so-called left is going to be talking about Buško jezero and how Croatia still benefits from Buško jezero that was given to Croatia, right, in the last hours of the existence of Herceg Bosna. Nobody is, so when the minute you even on the left pose the question of redistribution, it becomes ghettoized. So this is the extent to which national logic has become. It's like we are not immune. We are conduits of the privatization affect ourselves. I mean, we are not immune from it. And Fortunately, we are not immune for it because we have these blind spots. But I'm telling you that there are these moments when you can actually see that the poverty of our imagination is so present that we ourselves are putting the limits and barriers to our own thinking and action. I just gave you one concrete example that I can think of when it comes to the environmental as mental health issues, and which drives me berserk, right? Which drives me insane, right? So, but the psychic pain that's produced is actually now kind of pushing it even further into the ethno-nationalist identification. It's become so naturalized, I think, for all of us, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, right? But the environmental issues are also, and the catastrophes to which we are waking up from this narcosis, right? That we see ourselves not just with our bodies amputated, but like that our surroundings are so devastated that now we can make possible connections. And this could be the platform, but only if it follows the logic of the capital and demands the redistribution along more equitable lines, right? I mean, because fortunately, I'm not like, nature is regardless. Nature doesn't give a shit about us, right? It's going to do its own course. And like, rather than romanticizing it, poisons work across time scale and geographical scale. So that they will kill us gladly and irrespectively of whatever we do. But I think what the acceleration that we are witnessing, I mentioned this on CRES. I think Zizek beautifully termed this group of ethno-nationalist oligarchs as this kind of lumpen bourgeoisie that doesn't have any sort of consciousness, that can class consciousness, but is rampantly so greedy to gain capital and wealth that it is even willing to sacrifice itself. I mean, it's a suicidal mission, big time, because how else do we explain our own politicians living amidst these sort of contaminated environments? There is still, we are the problem because we still have the vestiges of belief that there is some sort of rationality behind it. I mean, that we are the problem. Because we still think there is some sort of rational choice behavior on their part.
And this belief that somehow through rational argument they can, someone can be convinced otherwise, and that is a big problem, because I think that we also have to be aware of what kind of violent response any sort of threat to this kind of greedy, irrational self-interest would cause. And this is obviously big concern, and something that actually we have to think about, because they once these interests are really endangered, they will use all forms of violence they have at disposal. We can't shriek away from that, and this is unfortunately not a very pleasant topic for many on the progressive scene, because somehow they would still like to have it all happening in non-violent way and beautiful soul kind of way. And it's just one of the things that we have to really fight against, these fantasies of political activism that we still have on the left, that somehow you will eschew somehow some form of violence. This, I think, is I don't know how we go about it, but well, we do it in particular ways, but I think that it's one of our biggest challenges, saying, well, our struggles will not be necessarily non-violent, because we will have to respond to violence through violence in this or that moment. I mean, in Dita, when they were protesting, they built trenches like it when they were defending the factory, using their war experiences from how to entrench themselves. So I'm not saying we will get to this situation, although it wouldn't be like necessarily perhaps that bad, but I think people are also deep down really aware that that there were, if they really threaten power, there will be huge level of violence. So we have to somehow bring this into discussion. How do we deal with this without necessarily immobilizing ourselves? We can't get kind of stuck once we get to the topic or the actual acts of violence. How can we work this through without getting into stasis? I mean, once Damir said narcosis, but yes, it's a form of stasis that has been politically produced as a civil war in our heads. And that's why in the last 20 years, with all these identitarian questions and a little bit of economic questions on the side, the economic catastrophe happening inside and across our little borders has ensued. And we still don't have like transnational left environmentalist movement happening in the region. That is really leftist. We have some sort of transnational corporations, but as I say, ideologically they're all over the place. But the emotions are there. Emotions are there. Important emotions are there. And how are they getting mobilized? Emotions to defend something that is public good.
The soul is willing, the body is weak. So, yes. Denis.
Hvala, Damire. Thank you all for really interesting and inspiring discussion. I was moved to raise my hand through the usage of word narcosis or hypnosis, because it reminded me that someone recently said that the oil of our times is our attention, and I do believe that the true partisanship of today is the rewinning of our attention. And this is something that we can do on individual level, but also collectively. And we can work on pop-up examples of that what is really important to us collectively, and be it commemorations or human chains. And I think we should not underestimate the power of pictures and gestures. And this is something that it's also relatively simple to do and organize, and even shared vulnerability has power and message. And to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. We probably won't have a one-button solution, but we'll have to meet the vulnerability all over the time again, and then reconnect again. Even if only one work of Sloboda Dita is appearing on the square in the city of Tuzla, he sends a message. So, attention partisanship.
Actually, I'm very pleased that you brought this up, because then it can actually it actually leads us to the question of time and how time is becoming a commodity. So time as a commodity, and the book that Damir and I have been writing forever, the last millennium, as he said, it's called Time Political, because we are actually talking about the production of political time, and being very much also inspired also by the work of Benjamin. So hopefully our Time Political will see the day of life one of these years ahead of us, if not hopefully next year. But precisely that's how do we produce time for political action? That is our key question. Time. This is like the material conditions, producing the material conditions for our transformative politics. And I think we talk about space, vision, agents, etc. But actually we are forgetting the fourth dimension, which is the key, and that is time. And time is getting commodified and stolen and taken away. And we all say, like, I can't, I'm working everywhere, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough time, I don't have time for this, I don't have time for that. But on the left, I think that is our key struggle. How can we collectivize time in a way? That is something that I would like to have more time to write about and to think about. And I think maybe, and it's very important that we actually collectively think about it.
My immediate association to what Denis said, as oil of our time being our attention, is that, what psychoanalysis teaches us is this very important lesson, and this is how to be timely in our interpretations, which actually relies mostly on how differently we listen and intervene, right? It's not just that we have to adjust the tempo and not either be too soon or to be too late. And I think we've been seeing in our work certain periods when we have been timely, and this has produced very particular effect, but precisely because we have been attentive and listened differently to what was happening, right? So to say, on the ground. And at other times, we have either been too soon or we have been too late, right? So I think in other words, time as political time is really being timely and being attentive differently to what's going on in reality, and how you work with that.
Jasmina should join us on Sres, Damir.
Absolutely.
And we need to do things to move on.
Yes.
These discussions. But Holger, do you want to comment? Because I watched this The Century of Self documentary. Jasmina, you saw it too.
I've been following the work of Adam Curtis maybe for years now. He's a very, his documentaries are very good to recommend to students, and thank you for
it's just a very good match.
As something just to start the discussion with them, I would say, because kind of it's very good as something to bring them into discussion about certain things. So thanks for that, Holger.
Jasmina, I have the invitation with Jasmina together. I mean, we could organize on Sres Buško Jezero action, right? to really start the mapping out of the political economy around the enclosure and expropriation of Buško jezero.
But we can also talk about other things that connect us, trans-borders, like nuclear waste happening close to Una, for instance, the disposal happening there, or we can talk about all these things that are happening from this and that side of the Drina around lithium, etc. I mean, it's there in Serbia, but also it's happening on Ozren as well, probably. I mean, they're still doing testing and keeping it hush hush quiet, etc. So maybe kind of select few transnational things that connect us, but also in a sense precisely of like producing this political tie, which is both being timely, but also be kind of very clever in the sense of how we play on things like key political virtues that we need for action, and that is like fortitude or cunningness or courage or etc. So it is about being the right moment, but also being really really reflecting and knowing how we can mobilize the political virtue that is necessary for sustaining collective action and effort. Yeah, but stress and something along these lines of like, what does it mean, the left, the action on the left when it comes to ecological justice now, and what are the lessons that we bring from different struggles that we had locally and regionally in the last 30 years would be nourishing.
And perhaps I can come in with one more question, and this is really from personal interest and just abusing the privilege that I have you two here. So when you said Damir, how the lake is never mentioned in the Croatian left, I think another thing that's very rarely mentioned, I would say in like regional left, are rural issues and just like rural areas. And I think now when Jasmina was saying to talk about ecological issues, I think in the articulation of these new environmental movements, it's very difficult to articulate them with and for people actually living in rural areas where these things are happening. And this is because I have done a little bit of work on agriculture, and I hope to continue doing so. And then there is really this problem of not even just kind of the politics that are happening in rural areas, but also this not political time, but research time of spending time in rural areas, getting to know rural areas, because I think it is very, and I don't know, maybe this is a bit too harsh of me to say, but I think in both research and kind of articulating these political issues, it's much easier to stay in the urban centers and talk to people that are somehow familiar, no matter where they come from, rather than engaging with rural spaces. And this is something that I'm trying to do in my new project. So I just wanted, it's a really open question of, have you encountered this, and how does it come in your work, both academic and activist? And another reason why I have been thinking about this more, because I do think it is a partially heritage that comes from Yugoslavia. This idea that seljaštvo is something that is a backward element in the modernist project of Yugoslavia. And I do wonder how, well, my impression is that it's still very much present and articulated differently. So I was just wondering if you could, just your thoughts or experiences on this. Thank you.
Okay, I'll comment on this a little bit. I agree with that, because I think there is a lot of how would you say in the old language, bourgeoisie tendencies amongst the left, in the sense of like this snobbishness when it comes not just peasantry, but also the actual working class. I mean, we've seen that in protests and plenums, and after that, and the comments that were made about dita workers by the left, which were basically deeply disdainful of the actual working class. Like they have, I don't know, comments on the feminist left. Oh, those workers, all they want is just someone to buy them off and sort out their salaries, basically, which actually shows you that there is a sort of like huge problem on the left with the masses that they have to work with, because they are not either urban enough or enlightened enough, etc. As for so I would say that this is obviously reflected in who works in the base. Actually, the actual people living there, or feminists, like, oh, I can't work, I'm not working in the base. I can basically, throw off ideas of this, of feminist enlightenment with my friends online and this and that. But if I have to go and work with actual women, then I really face patriarchy, internalized, and misogyny by women themselves, which is really, a challenge to work with. But it's the only terrain where actually you can, the proper terrain, proper political terrain, where you actually have the transformative politics if you go there. So how to, basically the problem is, why do people choose comfortable positions for their research and activism? Obviously, we can't do everything. There is always, we have to do some sort of balance, but structurally speaking, overall, yes, it's a huge problem, because you're not, you're avoiding working with actual people who are active. I think it's a little bit changing when it comes to ecological activism of women, because there you see that especially around rivers now, that's really interesting, in the sense of like there isn't this division between urban and rural, or there is less. There is less. So it's
my association to what Katarina said was that yes, I mean, we can be critical of Yugoslav Socialist project on treating the village as the backward, right? But we also have to see what kind of emancipation it has brought to the villages. I mean, we mustn't neglect the anti-fascist Front of Women's work, in particular about literacy amongst women and really opening up spaces for that, and allowing for some sort of mobility of women in particular in a society. So I think I would be a bit wary of the danger of kind of homogenizing Yugoslav Socialist project and really thinking that it clustered villages as completely backward. I think the production shows that how villages were crucial in terms of basic production of food and other things. My question would be: is there such a thing as village today? I think when I think about it, is that the far right has been so, or ethno-nationalist elites, let me call it this way, they have amazingly co-opted the village in terms of making a village or whatever remnant of it, because now I can just see the sprawl. It's like a long sprawl between urban area and the village. I don't think there is such a thing as a village anymore.
They're also depopulated.
There are suburbs. So in a way, there are clientelist networks working amazingly in these kind of suburban areas. I mean, that is made further complicated by the disgust that in this kind of racist imaginary, urban racism works against suburban areas, right? And I think that's something that the bourgeois sentiment, the urban bourgeois sentiment, or as they would say, fina gradska raja, right? I mean, even the term gradska raja is an oxymoron, right? right? So how can you be Raya and at the same time be from the city, right? From Grad, and how you can claim this kind of basic outcast element, right? So, but this is how kind of urban racism works. So I think we haven't been good enough in going to the villages, precisely because we see the greater push from the villages of towards urban areas, precisely because they have been co-opted and enticed and bribed into this kind of clientelist networks. I think, and opposite that, what kind of shows up, which I think is part of the problem rather than the solution, are these kind of almost like these new age obscurantist little oases, right? So can we actually, is that the only solution? Like, is that the response to the clientelism of this? Is this kind of like little new age or obfuscation as the only escape possible? How can we think about collectivization that works, in rural areas, suburban areas, akin to say what's going on, for instance, in India? I mean, I think India has shown great ways of how you work in these suburban areas outside of big places, particularly when it comes to cinematic production and how cinema is used against this kind of Modi followers that I mean, villages are a bit more harsher, because you either get co-opted into the far right, or there is no way of earning. And I think something similar happened to us in the past 25 years. When I say us, I mean Yugoslavia, precisely because, I mean, let's turn it on its head. Villages were depleted, not just the cities as well, but nobody's actually talking about the depletion of villages and the crumbling of the infrastructures, right? Like, Yugoslav socialism could imagine villages having cinemas, theaters and stuff. Ethno-nationalist projects cannot imagine that, right? They can imagine monuments to the dead, and that's about the only thing they can imagine. Like, but any sort of infrastructure of care and support, of like, and don't even, I'm not going to go into the cultural production. I mean, hospital, like medical treatments, like, this is the paucity of today's political projects by ethno-nationalist elites, that they have both at the same time co-opted and forced people from rural areas to do this kind of mobility, because everything is happening in the town, and given up on the village.
I just wanted to say, following on to break up this lovely conversation, I have a lecture at 2 and I have to make my way to the university, so I have about 10 minutes left to talk to you, and then I'll have to leave. I see a comment by Tom here on Gradska Raya, civilized savages. Well, Raya, I would say etymology of the word Raya should not be underestimated here, because it also has the radical potential. It's plebs, but also it's maybe Raya, when you look etymologically, it's more like this multitude, because it comes from stado, yato, and also really, really poor classes. Definitely not becoming to the elites, non-elite people, narod, in a way, but not, but basically, but also without privileges. So not necessarily savages, but the multitude would be perhaps an interesting play with Raya as a word, etymologically speaking, but colloquially it has layers of meanings, and it also has this layer of meaning where it actually means friends, some sort of comradeship, Raya. So and when you say Fina Gradska Raya with this ironic take, the ironic take, as Damir said, is in this Fina Gradska, that is like the urban, the ironic take on urban racism.
If I can only shortly add regarding rural and urban dichotomy, there is again the question of time. Time in the cities is another one as in rural areas. And I have worked for 8 years in Dalmatian hinterland and hosted several times people from the left scene who would like or conducted surveys. And very often it was so that they didn't have enough time. They said, I'm coming with the train in the afternoon and I have to leave on the day afterwards. And I was thinking, man, this doesn't function that way here. You need time to sit down, judicati, popit, cow. This doesn't go the way, you have another appointment. And I would just like to share an anecdote of a Dutch photographer who really understood it, although he was for the first time there. And he wanted to do some pictures on returnees. And eventually he visited a village of 3 ladies who were living on their own. And then he realized that he cannot make the picture in one day and decided to camp 7 days in the village to spend each day with the 3 ladies from the morning till the evening. And he shot his pictures on the last day and they were beautiful, but he took the time necessary for it. So we shouldn't forget also our snobism, left snobism that is also sometimes present, unfortunately. A fine one.
Dennis, what's the name of the photographer?
It's Jeroen Swolfs. I can write it down. Maybe one can find the picture somewhere.
Or just at least, at the very least, write down his name. So.
Yeah. I'll just a moment.
Thanks. Okay, well, I think if there are no other questions, comments, I'm just going to mark the end. As in every time, there needs to be a beginning and an end. Thank you very much, Jasmina, for your generosity, and thank you all for your generosity and for actually participating and taking the time to be here with us today. So,
hvala puno, Jasmina.
Hvala puno. Hvala.
Hvala.
bye-bye.
Hvala, živjeli.
Hvala Centru za napredne studije. Hvala Damir, puno. Hvala svima. Thanks everyone.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Yes.